That night I heard a whisper that was barely a breath, but strong enough to tear apart my peace. Gary, Indiana. A cold evening in early spring. Michael was 7 years old. I still remember the smell of old wood in the wings that day, the musty smell of the local stage being hastily cleaned, the dim lights intermittently dimmed by the unstable electrical system. Everything shook slightly, as if someone was holding their breath with me. That night, the Jackson 5 were about to take the stage. I stood backstage, silently observing my children, each a piece of the puzzle I had cherished since I was in the cradle. But there was one child I watched every little move, Michael. He was always more sensitive than his brothers, so delicate that even a strange sound, a look, an out-of-sync breath would make him hesitate. He sang well since he was a baby. Everyone could see it. But the fragility inside him, the fragile crystal waiting to break, I was the only one who could hear it clearly. And that night, that crystal began to crack. Michael stood against the dark velvet curtain, his tiny hands clasped tightly around the microphone. The backstage lights cast shadows on his face, highlighting his wide, round eyes, reflecting the tension of a 7-year-old placed in a place not meant for the faint-hearted. I walked slowly closer, step by step, afraid that if I moved too fast, he would shrink away like a frightened little bird. Before I could say anything, I heard him whisper, "I can't." Just 2 words, but they pierced the air, thin, sharp as a cold knife. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a memory recorded in a book or a famous family moment. It was an anecdote passed down by word of mouth among those who were there, who witnessed it, who knew Michael better than the stages that followed. But to me, it was the most chilling truth I'd ever experienced as a mother. After that whisper, Michael lowered the microphone to his stomach. His fingers clenched so tightly I could see the tips of his fingers turn white. He didn't cry, he didn't tremble, but his silence was so much more terrifying. It was the silence of a storm that hadn't yet exploded. I looked around. The other kids were fumbling with their shirts, trying out a few rhythmic steps, no one noticing Michael's mood. Everything around him seemed to separate, leaving me and him standing in a thick pool of air. I moved closer. I bent down. I looked at him closely. He avoided my eyes. I knew it. I understood. In this moment, Michael didn't want anyone to see his confusion. I touched his shoulder lightly, just one touch. But I felt the tension beneath his thin shirt, as if the pressure of the world was pressing down on his small shoulders. "Michael," I called softly. My voice was steady, but inside it was as chaotic as a drum set being beaten out of rhythm. He looked up, his dark, flickering eyes suddenly filled with a fear I had never seen before. Stage fright? Maybe. Fear of expectations? Very likely. But there was a deeper fear, the fear that he wasn't good enough. I recognized it immediately because I'd seen it in the mirror every time I'd placed expectations on myself. Just then, noises from outside the stage drifted in, the clacking of clogs, the sound of someone testing a microphone, a musician tuning a string. The sounds made the atmosphere even more tense. It was like a countdown, forcing him to step into the light just as his heart wanted to run away into the darkness. I knew I had only seconds before things spiraled out of control. I crouched down until my face was inches from Michael's, so he wouldn't have to hide anymore. I spoke in a voice so low that only we could hear, a secret between 2 trembling souls. "You don't have to sing the whole thing. You just have to sing the first line." I saw his lips purse, a small sign of the internal struggle that was raging inside. In the next second, I saw Michael torn. One side wanted to step back, run away from responsibility. The other side wanted to be strong enough to face himself. It was the scariest moment. Not because he was weak, but because I saw him grow up so fast. I could hear my heart pounding, each beat as if it were trying to help him fight the crisis that was engulfing him. I thought I would hold him close, whispering gentle words like any other mother. But no, I knew that if I shielded him too much, he would never overcome his own fear. So I added a sentence that surprised even me. "If you stop today, you will always wonder how well you could have done." Michael stood still, frozen. a long, suffocating moment. Then he looked up. Those frightened eyes suddenly changed color, as if a tiny flame had been lit. I knew. In that moment, everything shifted, and that was just the beginning. Before I could look away from Michael's eyes that had just lit up, the MC's voice outside rang out, long and piercing the air. 5 minutes! Just 2 simple words, but the atmosphere backstage tightened. I felt each reverberation like a tap on my chest, forcing me to face the reality. My time with my child was running out very quickly. Michael gripped the microphone so tightly that his fingers trembled slightly. The light from the stage shone directly on his face, making his expression even more clear, sharper, more painful. He didn't say anything more, not because he was okay, but because he was fighting in silence. And that silence, again, scared me. I kept my hand on his shoulder for a few more seconds, trying to give him a little warmth, a little calm. Not to force him to sing, but to remind him that he wasn't alone. But even so, I could still hear his rapid breathing, each breath threatening to break his small chest. I leaned closer, close enough to hear Michael's own heartbeat, fast, chaotic, erratic. "Can you hear me?" I asked very softly. Michael didn't answer, but his eyelids twitched, a sign, a reaction, a void he hadn't filled. I knew I had to do something right now, precisely sharply, like someone defusing a bomb in the last moment. One small mistake, one wrong word could shatter him. I took a deep breath. Then I said, "Michael, you don't need to be strong right now. You just need to take one step." A simple sentence. But in the context of that moment, it was like a lifeline, because I saw it in his eyes. He wasn't afraid to sing. He was afraid to get the first line wrong. Those off stage saw Michael as strong, confident, always shining. But here, just minutes before the show, he was just a 7-year-old child trying to stand firm in the face of an emotional storm he shouldn't have faced yet. I touched his face again, using my hand to block the bright stage light that was shining directly on him. When the light faded, I saw his eyes finally rest on me. And I said the words I'd uttered in Chapter 1 in panic, but this time, I said them slowly, deliberately, like a sharp scissors cutting through the air. "If you stop today, you'll always wonder how good you could have been." Immediately, Michael held his breath. His eyes widened, and I saw the movement inside, like a door about to open. Not loud, not explosive, but a sharp change of direction that happened in a quiet second. That was when I understood. It's not that I don't dare. It's that I'm afraid that if I dare, I have to dare to the end. A sound of a musician's shoes walking past made me jump slightly. It seemed like everything around me was trying to intrude on the private moment between mother and son. The sound of testing the instrument, the soft laughter, the sound of footsteps rushing back and forth, all mixed into a kind of noise that made the air thicker. The backstage now felt like the hallway of an upcoming crime scene, where everyone knew something was about to explode, but no one knew what it was. I looked at Michael. He took a deep breath, the first since I heard, "I can't." It was the breath of a child gathering all the courage he had left. "Mom," he called softly. Just one word, a thin, trembling sound like the sound of a glass hitting the rim, but to me, it was a sign that he was back. He had decided. I placed my hands on either side of his face, feeling the coldness of his skin from the tension. I leaned down, my forehead lightly touching his. A long, silent moment, as if time had stopped. "You're not alone," I whispered. "I'm here." That was it, nothing more. No promises, no reassurance, just confirmation of my presence in his turbulent world. Michael blinked once, then twice, then he nodded. A nod so slight it was barely noticeable to others, but to me, it was thunder. Not because it was loud, but because I knew he had chosen to step. I took a half step back so he wouldn't feel clingy. Michael relaxed his shoulders, tightening his grip on the microphone, not to protect himself this time, but to prepare to sing. One of my brothers called out, "Michael, it's your turn." I saw the door to the stage open, the blue-white light from the primitive lamps cutting through the backstage like a knife. It divided the space, darkness on one side, harsh light on the other. And Michael stood right at that boundary. I heard him take a final deep breath, his breath shaky but steady. Then he turned. He took a step forward. The first footstep echoed softly on the old wooden floor, but in my heart it resonated like the beat of fate. He took another step, and another. Each step seemed to lead him away from my arms, away from my protection, away from the safe shadow of his childhood. As his small figure merged with the stage light, I stood in the darkness, but my heart followed him, following every movement, every breath. Michael walked to the edge of the stage. He paused for a second long enough for the fear to return. I held my breath. Then, without turning, without looking for me, Michael raised his head. I saw from where I stood. His shoulders straightened, not high, not strong, but enough. The lights illuminated his face. The crowd outside began to cheer softly, and Michael held the microphone. It all happened in a matter of seconds, but to me, it stretched like a never-ending road. Michael stood at the edge of the stage, his microphone raised to his mouth. His hand shook slightly, enough for the spotlight to cast a shimmering halo, like his own heartbeat was racing. I stood in the shadows behind him, eyes unblinking, as if I would lose the moment forever if I blinked. The bass drummed a low beat from the orchestra. The crowd settled, the murmurs fading, as if everyone unconsciously sensed something was about to happen, something no one could define, but everyone was waiting for. Michael didn't turn to look for me again. He stood there, alone, a 7-year-old, under a light too big for his small shoulders. I listened to my son's breathing, not with my ears, but with my heart pounding in my chest, because in that moment I felt like there was an invisible thread between us. My son breathed, I held my breath. My son trembled, I hurt. My son was brave, I melted. The light shone directly on his face, making his eyes sparkle. Not the sparkle of confidence, but of the effort not to let fear take over. The whole room was silent, as if the world were waiting for him to utter the first word. And then Michael took a deep breath, softly, but enough for me to hear, even from a distance. A heavy breath that seemed to carry all the internal struggles of chapters 1 and 2 compressed into a tiny lung. I saw his shoulders drop, then rise again. A small movement, but to me it was louder than thunder. And then Michael spoke. Just one word, a tiny word, but it drowned out all other sounds in the room. Nothing moved, no whispers, not a chair creaked. Michael's voice, as soon as it touched the air, made the packed auditorium freeze. This was entirely based on reality. Since childhood, Michael had a voice that amazed adults, clear, full of emotion, and with a depth beyond his age. But then, watching him blend into the light, I felt like that sound did not come from the short 7 years he had lived, but from somewhere farther, deeper, older. I got goosebumps from head to toe, not because he sang well, but because I realized he had just conquered a fear too great for a child. Michael did not look down at his feet. He looked straight ahead into the white light that obscured the faces of the audience. His eyes were not searching for anyone, but seemed to be conversing with each soul sitting before him. I remember clenching my fists so hard my fingertips were cold. I tried not to cry, tried to stay calm so as not to disturb him. But as he sang the second and third lines, my heart was squeezed by an indescribable emotion, pride, grief, and suffocation. The trembling in Michael's body disappeared. His body relaxed, his feet moved forward a small step, almost unconsciously, as if the song was pulling him in, carrying him away from the fear that had just gripped him. At that moment, I saw a clear change, a plot twist I hadn't expected. The light no longer swallowed him yet, but began to follow him. Michael sang as if the stage was the only place where he belonged. With each note he sang, the space shrank, gathering around him. The rest of the Jackson 5 kids looked at him, their eyes no longer filled with surprise, but with recognition. And I stood there, stunned. It was like watching a slow-motion scene where the main character had just broken out of his darkness and stepped into the light created by fate. No one in the audience knew what had happened backstage. No one heard "I can't." No one saw him tremble. No one knew he had almost not made it onto the stage. They only saw a 7-year-old boy lighting up the entire auditorium, and I, standing in the darkness, saw the whole truth behind that halo. A truth that made me want to burst with pride and also to step up and pull him into my arms like he had when he was a toddler. But I didn't move forward. This was Michael's moment, the moment where if I interfered, I would ruin it all. So I stood still, watching him sing, watching him reach out from his fear, watching him become a version of himself that I hadn't even dared to believe he could reach a moment before. I don't remember every word he sang, not because it wasn't good, but because my emotions drowned out all other sounds. What I remember most clearly is the final image as the song ended. Michael standing up straight, the microphone slowly lowered, and the room fell silent for half a second. A silence that took my breath away. Then, applause. A round of applause so loud that the curtain behind me shook slightly. I closed my eyes, not to be proud, but to feel what I knew. Michael had walked through his own door, and that door, once opened, would never close again. The applause, it didn't just ring, it exploded. A tremendous roar, rolling in layers like a wave crashing onto the shore. I stood backstage, my eyes still glued to Michael's small figure in the spotlight. My child was almost motionless, as if unsure how to react to the force of the applause. I had heard audience applause many times before, but this time, it was different. It was so loud, so real, so unexpected, as if someone had opened the floodgates and let a flood of emotions rush into the stage. Michael didn't turn. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He didn't run back like a child does after accomplishing something he's proud of. He stood still, in the light, in the cheers, in the glory that just a few minutes before he was so scared he wanted to drop the microphone and disappear. And in that moment when she stood still, I knew she had overcome her fear. Not with a shout of triumph, not with joy, but with the silence of someone who had just gone through a psychological storm so deep that she didn't quite believe she had escaped. I saw her hand relax, the microphone slightly leaving her palm as if she had just realized she was still holding it. She let out a breath, very softly, but from where I stood, it sounded like a stifled sob. The stage lights gradually dimmed, changing from harsh to warm yellow. Her brothers stepped forward to stand on either side, as if reorganizing the formation. But even though they tried to smile, I could see a hint of shock in their eyes. They had also just witnessed something none of them expected. Finally, the MC gestured with his hand for the group to retreat backstage, a small sign. But behind it was a scissors cut, that moment of light, pulling Michael back into the darkness where I was waiting. Michael walked slowly. No one saw it was unusual. But I knew he wasn't slow because he was enjoying the moment of victory. He was slow because he was exhausted, because he had just used all his strength to keep himself from breaking. He stepped over the boundary of the lights and immediately entered the dark area behind the wings where the light couldn't reach. There I was standing, waiting for him, as always. As he entered, I caught a slight bend in his knees, very slight, enough for outsiders to not notice. But to me, it felt like a blow straight to the chest. I rushed towards him and caught his small body just in time before he completely lost his balance. Michael leaned almost all his weight on me. I felt his breath on my shoulder, hot, rapid, like someone was squeezing his lungs. I leaned close to his ear. "Michael, are you okay?" No answer, just a long breath, thin as a thread, as if he no longer had the strength to form words into sentences. I reached up to stroke his sweat-dampened hair. It was matted in little curls, not because the stage was hot, but because of the terrible stress he had just experienced. Behind us, the applause still echoed from the auditorium, but here, where it was just me and him, everything was silent, like a space that had just been cut off from the world. I pulled him closer, holding him with an arm strong enough to keep him steady, but not so strong that he felt crushed. "You did well," I whispered. Michael looked up at me. Those eyes, oh, those eyes hurt my heart. No pride, no fear, just utter exhaustion, the exhaustion of a little soul that has just gone through a battle beyond its capacity. I reached out to touch his cheek. It was cold, not because of the weather, but because he had pushed himself too hard. His brothers ran in from the stage, bustling. "Michael, you did it! You're the best tonight! Did you hear the applause?" But Michael didn't answer them. He didn't look at them. He looked at me, only me, as if I was the only thing he could hold on to so he wouldn't be sucked back into the emotional whirlpool. He said softly, his voice so hoarse I almost didn't hear him, "Mom, I'm tired." Those 2 words, simple, but they pulled my heart down like a stone. I held him tighter. No more words, no need to say anything. The whole world out there could be cheering, calling Michael's name, proud of the voice that had just silenced them. But to me right now, he was just a 7-year-old, trembling in my mother's arms. In the distance, I heard the sound of props being pulled away, people calling to each other to prepare for the next act. The stage was still running, still lit, still noisy, but amidst all the commotion, I felt like Michael and I were standing in a sealed glass room where only our breathing and heartbeats echoed. Michael leaned his head on my shoulder. I could feel his breathing gradually even out, but his body was still heavy, as if fighting the aftershocks of the fear that had been forced out of him so quickly. "I know. This moment will change you." The audience saw a star blossom, but I, and I alone, saw a child who had just passed another stage of childhood, and the most heartbreaking thing was, you did it alone, in the light, and I only had time to hold you when the light went out. There are nights that pass, and we forget as soon as our heads hit the pillow, but there are nights that never leave us. The night Michael, age 7, whispered, "I can't," though it's only a family anecdote, undocumented, was that night for me. And now, far from the spotlight, I can still hear it all. His shaky breathing, the soft click of the microphone on the wooden floor, the thunderous applause, and the eerie silence after he walked off the stage. But what I remember most is that whisper. I can't. 2 small words. Weak. But when they came out of a child the world would later call a legend, they carried unexpected weight. After I held him in the darkness backstage, where the stage lights couldn't reach, Michael began to catch his breath, not fast, not strong, but slowly, as if each breath were a return from a storm. He still leaned on my shoulder, not saying anything more. His silence was no longer the panic of the beginning of the show, but the kind of silence after having crossed a chasm he himself did not know how he had just crossed. I stroked his back. For the first time in hours, I dared to take a deep breath. His brothers were still standing nearby, their eyes both eager and worried. They waited for his reaction, a smile, a word, but Michael only closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened them to look at me, his eyes tired, but no longer afraid. That was when I realized the most dangerous thing was not that he was afraid of the lights. It was that the lights had demanded more from him than his childhood could bear. The voices of the audience still echoed outside, even though the next act had already begun. A few people from the organizing committee ran by, congratulating the Jackson Five, saying that the performance had surprised them to death. I just nodded, holding Michael close to me, as if I let go for a few seconds, he would collapse from exhaustion. Someone joked, that boy was born to stand on stage. My heart sank a little when I heard that, because that night, only I know, he almost didn't make it onto the stage, and what he was born to do. No one has the right to decide for him, but when I looked at him at that moment, trembling, leaning on me to keep his balance, I understood. Whether he wanted it or not, he had just stepped onto the path where the spotlight would follow him for the rest of his life. Michael raised his head and whispered, "Mom," I can still hear them clapping, still hear them. His voice was so soft, it almost disappeared. I leaned down and touched my forehead to his, like I used to do when he was scared of the dark as a kid. They applauded because you sang with all your heart, Michael, not because you were perfect. He blinked. That seemed to help him relax a little. A few backstage crew members came over to give him water. Michael took the glass but didn't drink right away. He looked at the water, the distant lights reflecting off it, creating a blurry streak of light. I didn't know what he was thinking, but the look on his face made my heart ache. I realized he didn't understand how big he had done tonight. Not big in the sense of success, big in the sense of he had just traded a part of his innocence to overcome something called pressure. I gently took the glass from his hand so he wouldn't have to try harder. He looked at me as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. I spoke for him. You did what you thought was impossible. Michael bowed his head, then he pursed his lips. A small action, but I understood. He was afraid that the emotions inside him would spill out if he let loose a little. Mom, he called again. Just one word, but that word was more shaky. I held him close, hiding his face from everyone's gaze, and even though he didn't cry, I could still feel the trembling from his body, like a child silently admitting that the storm inside him had just passed. After a few minutes, when he began to stand firmly again, I let him go, but his hand still held my shirt so small, cold, and weak that I wanted to hold him again. I bent down. Are you still scared? Michael looked at me for a long time. Those flickering black eyes, the eyes the world would later love, were now filled with a new light, not confidence, but self-awareness. I don't know, she said honestly, but when I sing, I feel like the fear disappears. That sentence made me freeze for a few seconds. Not because it was beautiful, but because it felt like a warning that I didn't know how to explain. The light will always have the ability to make you forget your fear. And because of that, you will always return to it. A dangerous mechanism for a heart that is too soft. I stroked her hair. I didn't know if I was sowing a heavy fate into her life, but I knew one thing. Tonight, she had overcome something that many adults could not overcome. And when she had gone through, no one could ever come back. As we left the backstage out into the dark hallway leading to the back door, Michael turned back to look at the stage. He didn't say anything. He just looked. For a long time. I squeezed his hand. Let's go, son. Michael nodded, following me. But I knew his heart was still standing in that light. Years later, when the world saw Michael as a legend, when his name rang out everywhere, when his songs became icons, I still remembered that night, the night he was 7, the night he trembled, the night he stepped into the light that was not for children. And of all the thousands of memories of my life, the strongest memory was still that fragile whisper, I can't. A confession that only I heard, a small secret, a low note hidden deep under the brilliant ocean of glory that would follow, but it was that I can't. That was the foundation of the legend the world knew. The legend began not with a light, but with the trembling of a child in the dark, and I, the mother standing next to that child, was the only witness to that truth.